This lecture is on the sciences of anatomy and physiology. What is the study of anatomy and physiology? Anatomy studies the structure of the body. Physiology studies the function of the body. Complementarity of structure and function states that form reflects function. Here's the anatomical structures of the circulatory system. The heart is the central organ of the circulatory system, and it is connected to the rest of the body through a series of vessels, arteries, veins, capillaries. The physiology of the circulatory system centers around the beating action of the heart. The heart has 4 chambers, 2 of which receive blood, which are the atria, and 2 of which send blood to either the lungs or the rest of the body, and those are the ventricles. In order to receive blood and send blood, the chambers are designed so that they can receive blood and pass them to other chambers, and then these chambers, the ventricles, have a thick muscular wall compared to the atria, and the ventricles can then contract those muscles and pump the blood into the appropriate arteries. The pulmonary artery will go towards the lungs, where it can be replenished with oxygen, and the semilunar valve of the left ventricle will then lead to the aorta, and that will carry oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. So form reflects function. Here's another view of the chambers of the heart, as well as the muscles that allow for the pumping action. Again, illustrating the anatomy of the heart reflects the physiology. This is the complementarity of structure and function. So, to recall while we're on this slide, anatomy is the structure, physiology is the function. Let's look at the structural organization of the body. The following structures that build the body are listed from smallest to largest. The smallest structures are found in the atoms and molecules, and this is the chemical level of organization. Atoms and molecules cluster together in units called cells. The cells are the smallest unit of organized life. Tissues are groups of cells that share similar structure and function. An organ is composed of 2 or more tissues that function together. Organ systems contain organs that work together to perform a particular function. And the organism is the living organism comprised of multiple organ systems. So to review, from smallest to largest, the structural hierarchy of the body is the chemical level, cellular level, tissue level, organ system level, and the organism. This slide illustrates each level. The chemical level is composed of atoms and molecules. Atoms and molecules then form the cells, which make up the cellular level. Cells are the smallest unit of organized life. The tissue level is composed of similar types of cells that perform similar function. The organ level is made up of 2 or more different types of tissues. The organ system level contains organs that work closely together. And the organism is made up of many organ systems. The circulatory system is the system illustrated in this slide. There are 11 major organ systems that make up the human body. In the following slides, note the major organs and functions of these systems. The integumentary system forms the external body covering and protects deeper tissues from injury. It is composed of the skin, the hair, and the nails. Other functions of the integumentary system include synthesizing vitamin D and housing cutaneous receptors. Cutaneous receptors are part of the nervous system, and they receive the sensations of pain, pressure, touch, temperature. Other accessory organs of the integumentary system include sweat glands and oil glands. The skeletal system contains the bones, cartilage, joints, and it protects and supports the body organs, such as the brain, the heart, and the lungs. The skeletal system also provides a framework that the muscles use for movement. Bones act as levers upon which the muscles pull. Bone cells are formed within the bones, particularly the bone marrow. Bones also store minerals such as calcium and phosphate. The muscular system is comprised primarily of skeletal muscles that are attached to the bones of the skeleton. And this allows for the manipulation of the environment. Also, locomotion, movement, and facial expression. Other functions of the muscular system include maintaining posture and producing heat. The nervous system contains the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves. It is a fast-acting control system, and it responds to the internal and external changes of the body. It will send commands to the appropriate muscles and glands to respond to those senses that it received. The endocrine system contains 9 glands that are not connected to each other physically. However, these glands are called endocrine glands because they secrete their contents, which are hormones, into the bloodstream. And there, the hormones will circulate throughout the body. This system acts slower than the nervous system. However, the responses are longer lasting and more sustained. The processes that endocrine glands regulate are growth, reproduction, and metabolism. Glands of the endocrine system include the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, thymus, adrenal gland, pancreas, and the gonads, which are the ovaries and the testes. The cardiovascular system includes the heart and the blood vessels. The blood vessels transport blood, which carries oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, wastes, and other substances through the body. And the heart pumps blood. The lymphatic system is also known as the immune system, and it has 2 very major functions. The lymphatic portion picks up fluid leaked from blood vessels and returns it to the blood. This helps to circulate tissue fluid throughout the body, cleansing it of pathogens and waste products, and also making sure that fluids are distributed evenly throughout the tissues. The immune system houses the white blood cells, which are called lymphocytes, and these are involved in the immune response, which mounts the attack against foreign substances within the body. The organs of the lymphatic system include the lymphatic vessels, the thymus, the spleen, the lymph nodes, and the red bone marrow. The respiratory system contains the lungs, as well as the nasal cavity, pharynx, which is the throat, larynx, which is the voice box, the trachea, which is the windpipe, and the bronchi, which are divisions of the trachea that enter the lungs. The diaphragm is also shown, which is part of the skeletal system, because as it contracts and relaxes, it allows for inhalation and exhalation. The respiratory system keeps blood constantly supplied with oxygen and removes carbon dioxide. The gaseous exchanges occur through the walls of the air sacs called alveoli. The digestive system includes the GI tract, starting at the oral cavity, leading to the esophagus, which joins with the stomach, and then the small intestine, the large intestine, the rectum, and anus. Other structures of the digestive system include the liver, gallbladder, pancreas, which is not pictured here. The function of the digestive system is to break down food into absorbable units. Once those absorbable units are broken down, they can enter the blood. Then they are distributed to body cells for nutrients. Indigestible foodstuffs are eliminated as feces, which is the waste. The urinary system contains the kidneys, ureters, urinary bladder, and urethra. The kidneys eliminate nitrogenous waste from the body. They also regulate water, electrolyte, and acid-base balance of the blood. The filtrate from the kidneys becomes urine and travels down the ureters to the bladder, where it is stored until it is expelled through the urethra. The reproductive system is composed of the gonads, such as the testes and the ovaries, as well as the genitalia and accessory organs such as breasts. Testes produce sperm and male sex hormones. The male ducts and glands aid in the delivery of sperm to the female reproductive tract. Ovaries produce eggs as well as female sex hormones. The remaining female structures serve as sites for fertilization and development of the fetus. Mammary glands of female breasts produce milk to nourish the newborn. Now that we have explored the 11 organ systems of the human body, let's take a look at some anatomical terminology that will be used throughout the duration of this course. The proper usage of scientific terminology is essential for communication between members of the scientific community. Anatomical terminology ensures that communication is consistent within the medical community. I would recommend that you take a medical terminology course to facilitate your studies of anatomy and physiology. The first thing to mention is the anatomical position. This is a reference for describing where body parts are located and their relation to one another. In the anatomical position, the body is standing up and facing forward. The arms are at the sides with the palms facing forward. Legs are straight, feet are slightly apart, and the toes are pointing forward. Body planes are used when describing the location of structures during imaging and diagnostic procedures. A plane cuts the body into certain sections. The midsagittal plane divides the body into right and left sections. The coronal or frontal plane divides the body into anterior and posterior sections. The transverse or horizontal plane divides the body into superior and inferior sections. And the oblique plane divides the body diagonally. This illustration shows the planes. The midsagittal plane, shown in pink, runs along the midline of the body and divides the body into right and left halves. Here it is showing the skull developed into right and left halves. This gives us a lateral view. The coronal plane, also known as the frontal plane, shown here in purple, divides the body into anterior and posterior halves. Here is a coronal or frontal section of the skull. This gives us a frontal view, which will also be called an anterior view in your text. The transverse or horizontal plane, shown here in green, divides the body into superior and inferior halves. This gives us a cross-section. Here is the skull divided in the transverse or horizontal plane. You can see the cross-section of the brain. In your anatomy text, this will often be called superior or inferior. Directional terms describe relative locations of different body structures. Listed are the paired directional terms. Superior means towards the top of the body. Inferior is towards the bottom of the body. Next is anterior and posterior. Anterior is towards the front of the body. Posterior is towards the back. Next is ventral and dorsal. Ventral and dorsal are synonymous with anterior and posterior when referring to the human body. The ventral refers to the belly. The dorsal refers to the back. In a human who stands on two legs, the belly faces forward. Therefore, the ventral is synonymous with anterior. The dorsal, which is the back, in a human who stands on two legs, faces the back of the human, which is the posterior. This may be different in animals who walk on four legs. Next is medial and lateral. The medial is towards the midline of the body. View the midline of the body as corresponding to the vertebra. Lateral means moving towards the side. It's moving away from the midline of the body. Superficial and deep refer to the skin. Structures that are towards the skin are superficial. Structures that are towards the interior of the body are deep. Lastly, proximal and distal. This is used when referring to the origin of attachment of a structure. When looking at the anatomical position, proximal and distal best refers to the upper and lower limbs. Proximal means towards the attachment of the body. As we move towards our shoulders and our hip, we are moving proximally. Structures that are towards the fingers and the toes are distal. This table illustrates the orientation and the directional terms. Again, superior and inferior are paired. Superior is towards the head end or the upper part of a structure. The inferior is away from the head end or towards the lower part of a structure. Above and below. Above for superior, below for inferior. This table puts ventral and dorsal together with anterior and posterior. Remember, in a human who stands upright on two legs, ventral and anterior are synonyms. Dorsal and posterior are synonyms. This may be different in an animal who walks on four legs, because ventral is the belly and dorsal is the back. Anterior means facing forward, posterior means behind. In a human, the belly is facing forward. It's in the front of the body. In humans, the back, the dorsal, is behind the body, so it is posterior. Medial and lateral refer to the midline of the body. The medial is towards the midline of the body. Think of the vertebra. Lateral is away from the midline of the body, towards the sides, or away from the vertebra. Sometimes you will see the term intermediate or para, and that will mean between a more medial and a more lateral structure. When using proximal and distal, it refers to the point of attachment. And therefore, in anatomical position, proximal and distal will be best used on the upper and lower limbs. As the structures move towards the shoulders and hips, they are more proximal. As they move more towards the fingers and toes, they are distal. Superficial and deep refer to the skin. Superficial is towards the surface of the skin, so the surface of the body, and deep is internal, away from the skin, deeper into the body. When looking at the anatomical position, there are two major divisions of the body, the axial and the appendicular. The axial refers to the head, neck, and trunk. So again, picture the vertebra. So the skull, which is attached to the cervical, thoracic, and lumbar vertebrae, sacrum and coccyx. That is the axial, the midline of the body. The appendicular refers to the upper and lower limbs, or your appendages. Regional terms will designate specific areas within the axial and appendicular divisions. Before we move to the next slide, the axial body parts are featured here as the head, the neck, and the trunk on the anterior, and they are featured as the head, the neck, and the trunk on the posterior. The appendicular are featured in the upper and lower limbs. For the upper limbs, the shoulder girdle, the arm, the forearm, and the hand on the anterior. The shoulder girdle, the arm, the forearm, and the hand on the posterior. For the lower extremity, we see the pelvis, the thigh, the leg, and the foot on the anterior. And for the lower extremities on the posterior, again, the pelvis, the thigh, the leg, and the foot. Let's take a look at a more involved illustration of the axial and appendicular divisions of the body in anatomical position, and we'll look at each of the regional terms. Let's start with the head. This is the anterior head. The forehead is the frontal region. The eyes are the orbital region. The nose is nasal. The cheek is buccal. The mouth is oral. Not pictured here is mental, which is the chin. The otic is the ear. Now the posterior head. We see the occipital region, which is the back of the head, near the nape of the neck. The neck is called the cervical region, both anterior and posterior. The neck is the cervical region. Now let's look at the chest. This is called the thoracic region and includes the sternal, which is the breastbone. This is anterior. The mammary, which is the breast, also called pectoral. And the axillary, which is the armpit. The abdominal region is very large, and it also includes the umbilical, which is the belly button. Inferior to the abdominal is the pelvic region. Inferior to the pelvic region is the inguinal or groin. And inferior to the groin is the pubic or genital. On the posterior trunk, we have the dorsal region. The vertebral refers to the vertebral column inferior to the cervical region. So it includes the thoracic vertebra and the lumbar vertebra. Flanking the lumbar vertebra is the lumbar region. It's lateral to the vertebral, but you can basically use it to describe this entire lower back. The sacral region corresponds to the sacrum. And then we have the coccyx, and between the anus and the genitalia will be the perineum. Now let's look at the appendicular regional terms. The upper limb on both the anterior and posterior will contain the acromial region. This corresponds to the acromion of the scapula. You can feel it on your shoulders. It protrudes. Inferior to the acromial is your deltoid region. This is where you get vaccinations. The brachial region is inferior to the deltoid on both anterior and posterior. This is your upper arm. Featured on the anterior side is the antecubital. This is the ditch of the elbow. The elbow is on the posterior arm, and it's called the olecranon. The forearm is the antebrachial. It is in front of the upper arm, which is the brachial. So brachial is the upper arm, antebrachial is the forearm. The wrist is carpal, and it is featured on the anterior and posterior upper limb. On the anterior hand is the palmar, And then on both anterior and posterior hand is the digits, which include the pollex, which is your thumb, and the digital, which is your remaining fingers. For the lower limb, apologies, let me feature the scapular prior to moving to the lower limb, because the scapular is featured on the dorsal side, so it's posterior, but it is part of the upper limb. Thus, the appendicular for the upper limb contains the regions of the upper arm as well as what is called the pectoral girdle. And this supports the movement of the upper arm and includes the scapula and the collarbones or clavicles. Now we can move to the lower limb. The lower limb includes the pelvic girdle, which contains the hip bones. So this is the coxal region of the lower limb. On the posterior, the gluteal is found on the lower limb as well. On both anterior and posterior, we have the femoral region, which is your thigh. The knee is anterior and it is patellar. The popliteal is posterior and it is the ditch of the knee. The anterior lower leg is called the crural region. It corresponds to your shin. The anterior or posterior lower limb or lower leg is the sural, and it corresponds to your calf. So crural is shin, sural is calf. Lateral lower limb or lower leg is fibular. The ankle is tarsal. The heel is calcaneal. The bottom of the foot is the plantar region. And then the big toe is called the hallux. And then the remaining toes are digital. So the lower limb consists of the pelvic girdle, which is composed of your hip bones and your glutes. And then moving distally from the hips, we have the thigh, which is femoral, the knee, containing patellar and popliteal, and the lower leg, containing your shin, calf, and then your feet. So those are the regional terms used when describing the locations of structures on the anatomical position. You will see these moving forward through your studies of anatomy and physiology. Next, we'll talk about two major sets of body cavities that neatly organize and compartmentalize organs. These cavities are enclosed and protected by membranes, providing protection and support to organs. The two major sets of body cavities include the dorsal body cavities and the ventral body cavities. The dorsal body cavities includes the cranial and vertebral cavities. The meninges are the membranes that line the dorsal body cavities. The ventral body cavities include the thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities. The serous membranes, or serosa, are the membranes that line the ventral body cavities. This slide illustrates the dorsal and ventral body cavities. The dorsal body cavities align with the back and include the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. The cranial cavity contains the brain. The vertebral cavity contains the spinal cord. In a human, the dorsal body cavity is synonymous with posterior. The meninges are the membranes that line the dorsal body cavity. The ventral body cavity is on the belly side, and in a human, that will be synonymous with anterior. The ventral body cavities include the thoracic cavity, the abdominal cavity, and the pelvic cavity. Serous membranes are the membranes that line the ventral body cavities. Looking at the anterior view of the body, you can see that the thoracic body cavity will be compartmentalized into the pericardium surrounding the heart, the pleura surrounding the lungs, and the mediastinum occupying the space between the heart and the lungs. The abdominal and pelvic cavities are usually joined together and called the abdominopelvic cavity. And these contain the digestive viscera. The thoracic and abdominopelvic cavities are separated by the diaphragm. Serous membranes are thin, double-layered membranes separated by serous fluid. They are the supporting membranes for organs. They lubricate organs and prevent friction, and they protect against the spread of infection. There are two major types of serous membranes, the parietal serosa and the visceral serosa. The parietal serosa will line the body cavity. The visceral serosa will line the organ, and the space between will contain serous fluid. We'll talk about meninges when we get into the nervous system. This will focus strictly on serous membranes. In this slide, the serous membrane is illustrated around the heart, and also imagining if you put your hand into a balloon. The space between where your hand is and the actual balloon itself would be the serous space, and it would be filled with serous fluid. The part of the balloon that is going to touch your hand will be the visceral serosa. The part of the balloon that would touch the outer balloon is the parietal serosa. In the body, this outer balloon would be connected to your body cavity. So let's look at the heart to illustrate this with an actual organ. The part of the serous membrane that is connected to the heart is called the visceral pericardium. The lining of the serous membrane that connects to the body wall or the body cavity is the parietal pericardium, and the space in between is filled with serous fluid. Here's an actual image of the heart, and the visceral pericardium is connected to the heart. It's a nice, delicate membrane covering the heart. The parietal pericardium is a lot thicker. It's very tough, and it's connected to the body cavity. It's actually connected to the wall of your chest. And the space in between, illustrated here, will be filled with serous fluid. Remember, serous fluid will lubricate organs and prevent friction. So think about how many times your heart beats in a day, and that serous fluid acts like an oil to keep that lubricated. Serous membranes are named according to their location. So recall, the mediastinum is the space between the heart and the lungs. The pericardium surrounds the heart. The pleura surrounds the lungs. In the abdominopelvic cavities, the name for the serous membranes is the peritoneum. Here you can see the peritoneum surrounding the different digestive organs of the abdominal cavity. And then even around the liver, stomach, pancreas, small intestine, and large intestine. Those are the digestive organs surrounded by peritoneum. So the peritoneum that touches those organs is the visceral peritoneum. The peritoneum that is attached to the body wall is the parietal peritoneum. And the space inside is the serous fluid. Sometimes infections can happen within the serous membranes. Pericarditis is the infection of the pericardium. Pleurisy is the infection of the pleura. Peritonitis is the infection of the peritoneum. The abdominopelvic cavity is large, and thus it is divided into regions. There are two major divisions. There is the 9 regions and the 4 quadrants. The 9 regions are used for anatomical reference as they are more specific than the 4 quadrants. When looking at the 9 regions, it's like a tic-tac-toe board, and you can start with the umbilical region, which is central. All the other regions are related to the umbilical region. So superior to the umbilical region is the epigastric. Inferior is the hypogastric. Epi means above, hypo, below. Gastric means the stomach, referring to that umbilicus. To the right and left of the umbilical region are the lumbar regions. So the left lumbar region and the right lumbar region. Now if we go obliquely or diagonally to the lumbar region, we will see the left hypochondriac, and now let's look up at the right hypochondriac. So this is going to refer to the rib cage. Hypo is below, and then chondro is the cartilage of the rib cage. And then if we go diagonally down, inferior, away from the umbilical region, we have our left iliac and then our right iliac. The iliac refers to the pelvic bone called the ilium. However, it's also near the groin, so we call that the inguinal. These are common sites for inguinal hernias. And notice that the hypogastric region is also called the pubic region. So again, you can start at the umbilical region and play tic-tac-toe. You can go superior and inferior, right or left, and then you can go diagonally, superiorly or inferiorly. However you can memorize those regions best is up to you. And then the corresponding organs are pictured in figure B. So in the umbilical region is largely taken up by the small intestine as well as parts of the transverse colon. The epigastric includes the liver, stomach, and pylorus, part of the gallbladder. The hypogastric includes the small intestines, part of the colon, and the bladder. The right and left lumbar will both contain colon and intestines. The right hypochondriac will contain liver, gallbladder. Left hypochondriac will contain stomach, part of the spleen. And then the right and left inguinal, most importantly, the right inguinal contains the appendix. Then we see that the left inguinal will contain colon. Notice that we do not go above the diaphragm when talking about the organs of the abdominopelvic cavity. So do not include anything above the diaphragm when talking about the regions of the abdominopelvic cavity. Same goes for the 4 quadrants. These are going to refer to where organs are in the abdominopelvic cavity, so inferior to the diaphragm. The quadrants are for medical reference because they're less specific and they can refer to lacerations and injuries in a more generalized way. So the right upper quadrant refers to the liver, gallbladder, pylorus of the stomach, and portions of the colon and small intestine. Pain here can indicate hepatitis of the liver, cholecystitis of the gallbladder, or a peptic ulcer in the stomach. The left upper quadrant contains part of the liver as well as a majority of the stomach. We'll have the spleen, pancreas, and part of the colon and small intestines. The right lower quadrant includes the appendix as well as some parts of the ascending colon, and we have small intestines. So pain here can indicate appendicitis. The left lower quadrant primarily contains small intestines and descending and sigmoid colon. So pain here can indicate colitis, diverticulitis, ovarian cysts, or pelvic inflammatory disease. Homeostasis. This is our first physiological discussion. Everything with the anatomic terminology was anatomy. Now let's look at some physiology. So homeostasis is the ability to maintain relatively stable internal conditions despite ever-changing external conditions. This keeps the body's environmental variables at a set point within a normal range. It is a dynamic state of equilibrium. So as we move forward, you will be using the language of anatomy to describe the structures and locations of organs. And then when we talk about the physiology within these organ systems, we will be focusing on their ability to maintain homeostasis. The nervous and endocrine systems work together to maintain balance in the body. 3 components of homeostatic feedback loops are the receptor, the control center, and the effector. So I mentioned here once stimulus has been introduced. The stimulus is going to be the change from the set point. The set point is the normal range that our body maintains, be it temperature, blood chemistry, and the stimulus will be a change in that set point. So once the stimulus has been introduced, the receptor receives that change, and then it tells the control center about it, and then the effector will help to return us to our set point. This illustration begins with the stimulus. Notice that the stimulus produces changes in the variable. The variable will be what we are maintaining a balance in, be it temperature or blood chemistry. The receptor is part of the nervous system, and it will detect the change. It will send the input towards the control center, which is generally in your brain. And then the control center will carry out the effector, which will then be the organ that responds and brings us back to balance. So reading it word for word, step 1, the stimulus produces the change in the variable. Step 2, the receptor detects the change. Step 3, input is sent along the afferent pathway to the control center. Afferent means it's approaching the control center, which is generally in the brain. Step 4, information is sent along the efferent pathway to the effector. Efferent exits the brain. Step 5, the response of the effector feeds back to reduce the effective stimulus and returns the variable to homeostatic level. This is called the homeostatic feedback loop. Notice that we want to maintain a balance. This is our set point. Any change in the variable, that stimulus, will put us into a state of imbalance. Notice that levels can rise above our set point or drop below our set point. For instance, with temperature, you can either become too hot, so you can go above your set point of 98.6, or you become too cold. You fall below your set point of 98.6. Regardless of whether you go above or below your set point, the point of the homeostatic feedback loop is to bring you back into balance. The most common type of homeostasis is called negative feedback. Negative feedback is a mechanism that reverses the deviation from a set point. This is your deviation, whether you become too hot or too cold. That deviates from your balance of 98.6. So a negative feedback will use the receptor, the control center, and the effectors to bring the body back to ideal value within that normal range or set point. In my illustration here, I have the balance illustrating set point or normal range. That's green, happy. And then in the next illustration, you see that we have gone out of balance. We've either gotten too hot or too cold. And we don't like that. That's in the red. So negative feedback takes us away from our change and moves us back towards our set point, our normal range. That's why it's called negative feedback. It reverses the effect of our stimulus. The stimulus being the change in temperature. Here is the negative feedback mechanisms for keeping your temperature at a set range of 98.6. So that would be our balance. So the stimulus in the upper illustration, the stimulus is the body temperature rises. Receptors are the temperature-sensitive cells in the skin and brain. So these would be cutaneous receptors mentioned in the integumentary system. The information from these receptors will be sent along the afferent pathway to the control center. In this case, it's the thermoregulatory center in your brain, located in your hypothalamus. The information from the hypothalamus will then be sent along the efferent pathways away from the brain towards the effectors. In this case, it's your sweat glands. The response of your sweat glands is going to cause you to release sweat to the surface of your skin. And the evaporation of that sweat will cause your body temperature to fall. Once your body temperature goes back to its normal range of 98.6, the stimulus will end and you will stop sweating. Now let's look at the figure below our balance. Here we're getting too cold. So in this case, the stimulus is body temperature falls. So the receptors, again, are temperature sensitive cells in your skin and brain, so cutaneous receptors. They will carry that information towards the afferent pathway towards the control center, which will be the thermoregulatory center in your brain, or hypothalamus. Then the information from the hypothalamus will be sent along efferent pathways towards the effectors. In this case, the effectors are the skeletal muscles. Their response is shivering. So they will start to contract rapidly, and by doing that, they will release heat. Remember that skeletal muscles release heat as they contract. This will cause the body temperature to rise, bringing us back towards 98.6 degrees, our balance, our set point. And shivering will cease once we have warmed back up. So these are negative feedback loops, because once the stimulus deviates our balance from our set point, then the negative feedback loop will turn on to bring us back into balance. It will oppose the stimulus, whether we become too hot or too cold. So temperature is just one example. Remember, negative feedback is the most common type of homeostasis in the body. 99% of homeostatic mechanisms belong to negative feedback. In this video, turn off the laser pointer. This video illustrates negative feedback relating to glucose, insulin, and diabetes. So the homeostatic level for blood glucose level is 90 milligrams per 100 mils of blood. These also will relate to your A1C values. And so in the normal span of a day, your blood glucose levels will fluctuate. Right after a meal, your blood glucose levels will rise above 90 milligrams per 100 mils of blood. That is the stimulus. The receptors will be located in your pancreas, and they will send information to the brain about the blood glucose levels. And as a result, the pancreas will also be an effector, because it will then secrete insulin, which is actually the effector, I would say, that goes to all the tissue cells in your body and stimulates the uptake of glucose. Glucose needs to go into the cells because that's where it can be used to make energy. Leftover glucose will then be converted to glycogen in the liver and stored for later use. As a result, blood glucose will fall back to normal range. If you haven't eaten in several hours, then your blood glucose level will start to lower below 90 milligrams per 100 mils of blood. The stimulus will be the declining blood glucose levels. Receptors in the pancreas will receive that stimulus and send information towards the brain. The pancreas will then release glucagon, which acts as the effectors. This is a hormone that will stimulate glycogen breakdown in the liver. The liver will then release glucose from the glycogen it had stored back into the blood. Blood glucose will then rise to normal range. This normal range ensures that your cells have enough glucose to eat to make energy to carry out body processes. That illustrates the importance of homeostasis in maintaining normal blood glucose levels of 90 milligrams to 100 mils of blood. Negative feedback will work to reverse the effects of the stimulus, be they rising above the set point or dropping below. And as a result of negative feedback, we will come back into balance. Now let's take a look at the other type of feedback loop that is not as common. A less common type of homeostasis is called positive feedback. Positive feedback intensifies a change in the body's physiological condition rather than reversing it. A deviation from the normal range results in more change, moving the system further away from the normal range. Although this is less common, it is important in critical situations such as fever, blood clotting, and labor. However, if positive feedback mechanisms remain unchecked, they can lead to disease. We see this in clotting disorders and also heart disease. Here's an illustration of positive feedback. Notice that it just continues to loop. You don't necessarily see that balance on the fulcrum that we did with negative feedback. And this is because positive feedback continues to bring the stimulus further from the set point. It's a critical reaction to a dangerous situation that must be resolved quickly. So in this case, let's take a look at what happens when a vessel is torn. So in step 1, the break or tear occurs in a blood vessel wall. This causes blood to spill out of the blood vessel. This can be dangerous because if left unchecked, the body can bleed out. That is the case in hemophilia, and it can lead to death. And so, in order to make sure that that doesn't happen, positive feedback mechanisms will engage. So in step 2, the platelets are going to adhere to the site of injury. Platelets are going to be clotting proteins in our blood vessels. And as the platelets adhere to the site of the tear, they will release chemicals. These chemicals will then attract more platelets, which will then adhere to the blood vessel and release more chemicals, which will attract more platelets, which will adhere to the site and release more chemicals, which will attract more platelets, which will adhere to the site and release more chemicals, and we loop and loop and loop and loop until we form our platelet plug or our clot. Once we have clotted and plugged up the tear in our vessel, then we can stop our feedback. So the platelets will no longer release any more chemicals to bring any more platelets into the area. Now, as far as disease is concerned, if you have a clotting disorder and you continue to clot and clot and clot, then it can cause a thrombosis to form. And if a thrombosis breaks off, it will then travel through the bloodstream and can get caught in your lungs or your brain, where it will cause an embolism, which can be fatal, can cause a stroke. Thus, this has to remain checked. The platelet forms and then positive feedback must turn off. Another example is the Ferguson reflex seen in labor. So the stimulus begins when the baby has pushed against the cervix, particularly the head. This is the proper position of the baby before labor. Nerve impulses from the cervix will then be transmitted to the brain. The brain will then stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete the hormone oxytocin. Oxytocin will then be carried in the bloodstream to the uterus, where it will stimulate uterine contractions. This pushes the baby towards the cervix, dilating the cervix. As the cervix becomes more dilated as the head of the baby pushes against the cervix, more nerve impulses will be transmitted from the cervix to the brain. The brain will then release more oxytocin. The oxytocin will go to the uterus, it will stimulate more contractions, pushing the baby further towards the cervix, which will then send more nerve impulses to stimulate the release of more oxytocin, which will cause more contractions closer together until finally the baby is born. And after the baby is born and then the afterbirth is passed, then we should not have any more oxytocin coming into the area because the cycle has now completed. Homeostatic imbalance increases the risk of disease, whether through the inability to maintain negative feedback or through unchecked positive feedback. This contributes to changes associated with aging, and it can lead to heart attack, stroke, cancer, autoimmune disease, thyroid disease, hormonal imbalance, mood disorders, gastrointestinal disorders, kidney disease, and many other types of diseases. But remember, storms don't last forever, so try to maintain a healthy lifestyle despite all of the craziness in the world. And many blessings. Thanks for watching.